when silence learned how to smile again. There are moments in life that arrive quietly, without warning, without drama, without an audience waiting to applaud, and yet they carry more weight than any standing ovation ever could. For Keanu Reeves, that moment arrived on an ordinary afternoon disguised as nothing more than a pause between obligations, a space between one life chapter and the next. The city around him moved as it always did, loud, impatient, chasing the next headline, but Keanu sat still inside that motion, feeling the familiar distance between who the world believed him to be and who he actually was. Fame had taught him many lessons, most of them unspoken, but the hardest was this. No matter how many people recognize your face, loneliness can still sit beside you without saying a word. The cafe was small, tucked between buildings that looked like they had watched generations pass without caring much about who came and went. Keanu chose it for that reason. No glamour, no curated atmosphere, just wooden tables worn smooth by time and windows that let the light in honestly. He sat near the glass, his coffee untouched, his thoughts heavier than the rain that had just stopped falling outside. There was a stillness to him, the kind that comes from a man who has lived loudly enough to finally crave quiet. He wasn't hiding from the world that day, he was simply resting from it. As he stared at his reflection in the window, he thought about how strange memory can be, how it waits patiently for the right moment to surface. Without effort, a name formed in his mind, followed by a sound he hadn't heard in years. A laugh. Not the polite laugh offered during interviews, not the practiced smile held for cameras, but the real one, spontaneous, unguarded, human. Sandra Bullock. The memory carried warmth and ache in equal measure. They had shared years of work, friendship, understanding that never needed translation. Yet life had slowly pulled them in different directions, not through conflict, but through distance, timing, and the quiet erosion that happens when people assume there will always be another chance to reconnect. Keanu had learned that life doesn't always announce its turning points. Sometimes it simply opens a door and waits to see if you're brave enough to notice. When the cafe door chimed softly, he felt something shift before he even looked up, as if the air itself recognized what his mind had not yet accepted. He turned instinctively, and there she was, not as a headline, not as a legend, but as a woman standing in the doorway holding a book close to her chest, her expression calm, thoughtful, quietly present in a way that felt deeply familiar. Time did not rush between them in that moment. It slowed, allowing recognition to arrive gently instead of crashing down. Sandra noticed him at the same time. Their eyes met without surprise, without disbelief, only acknowledgement. Years had passed, but something essential remained unchanged. The sense that words were optional when understanding already existed. She walked toward him with unhurried steps, as if respecting the gravity of the moment, as if she understood that rushing would break whatever fragile honesty was forming between them. When she spoke, her voice carried warmth rather than nostalgia. She didn't ask if she could sit. She simply did, the way people do when history has already granted permission. Their conversation began not with grand revelations, but with simple truths. Observations about coffee habits, about time, about how strange it feels when life moves forward without asking whether you're ready. There was no need to fill the space with explanations. They spoke carefully, kindly, as two people who had both learned how easily words could be misunderstood when spoken too quickly. Beneath every sentence was a shared awareness of what had gone unsaid for years. Not accusations, not regrets, but a quiet sadness for moments lost to silence. When Sandra laughed softly at something small he said, Keanu felt it before he fully understood it. The sound reached him like a memory restored, gentle but powerful enough to loosen something he hadn't realized he was holding so tightly. It wasn't dramatic. No one else in the cafe noticed. Yet in that brief moment, something shifted inside him, something human and vulnerable and deeply real. He realized how long it had been since he had seen her truly at ease, since he had seen himself reflected in someone who remembered him not as a symbol, but as a person. They spoke about life, about grief, about the strange way success can isolate as much as it elevates. Sandra didn't dramatize her losses, and Keanu didn't minimize his distance from the world. They listened, truly listened, without interrupting, without fixing, without turning pain into performance. It was a rare kind of conversation, the kind that doesn't demand solutions, only presence. When she admitted that laughter had become something she rationed rather than enjoyed, Keanu didn't respond with wisdom or comfort. He simply looked at her with understanding, the kind that doesn't require proof. As the afternoon light softened and the cafe grew quieter, Sandra smiled again, this time without hesitation, without armor. It happened naturally, as if her body remembered how before her mind did. Keanu watched it unfold, felt the weight of years lift just enough to let air back in. He leaned forward slightly, not aware of anything beyond that moment, not aware of the world outside the glass, not aware that someone nearby had their phone pointed in the wrong direction at the wrong time. His whisper was barely audible, meant only for her, shaped by honesty rather than intention. It wasn't a declaration, wasn't a promise, wasn't something crafted for memory. It was simply the truth as he felt it in that instant, quiet, sincere human. Sandra looked at him, eyes soft, and nodded as if she understood not just the words but everything behind them. The laugh that followed wasn't loud, but it was real, and in it lived something neither of them had expected to find again so easily. Neither of them noticed the camera. Neither of them needed to. What mattered was that for the first time in a long while, two people who had carried their lives with dignity and restraint had allowed themselves a moment of unguarded connection. And in that moment, something fragile but powerful was born, not a story for the world, but a reminder for themselves that healing doesn't always arrive through struggle. Sometimes it arrives through recognition, through kindness, through the simple courage to sit across from someone who once knew you deeply and let yourself be seen again. When the world started listening, they chose silence. The morning arrived without ceremony, the kind that slips into the room quietly and waits to see whether you are ready to face it. For Keanu Reeves, it came with the low vibration of his phone resting on the nightstand, a sound he had learned to ignore over the years because it almost always carried noise rather than meaning. He lay still for a long moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the calm of the previous afternoon linger inside him like a fragile echo. There was something different in his chest when he breathed that morning, something lighter, and he wasn't in a hurry to disturb it. When he finally reached for the phone, he didn't expect what he saw, message after message stacking on top of each other, urgency leaking through every notification as if the world had suddenly decided it needed his attention all at once. He opened one link without curiosity, more out of habit than concern, and watched himself on the screen. The angle was imperfect, the sound faint, but the moment was unmistakable. There he was, leaning forward in a cafe he had chosen specifically for its privacy, his voice lowered, his expression unguarded, and across from him sat Sandra Bullock, smiling in a way the cameras rarely captured. The clip was short, barely a breath in length, yet it carried an intimacy that felt almost intrusive now that it had been pulled into the open. He watched it once, then turned the phone face down, not out of anger or fear, but out of instinct. Some moments, he believed, were never meant to be replayed. Across the city, Sandra stood in her kitchen holding a mug she had already forgotten to drink from, her phone resting against the counter as the same clip looped silently on the screen. She didn't feel exposed so much as misunderstood, as if the world had taken a sentence out of a much longer conversation and decided it knew the whole story. There were headlines forming already, interpretations layered on top of assumptions, strangers projecting their own hopes and heartbreaks onto something that had never belonged to them. Yet beneath the noise, she felt an unexpected calm. The laugh they kept replaying had been real, and no amount of commentary could take that truth away from her. They didn't speak immediately, not because there was nothing to say, but because both understood that the first response matters most when the world is watching. Keanu spent the morning walking through the city without direction, letting the movement ground him, nodding politely at people who recognized him, but said nothing. He noticed how differently the world felt when you weren't trying to outrun it. Sandra, meanwhile, canceled a meeting she no longer had the energy for and chose instead to sit with the quiet discomfort of being seen too clearly and not clearly enough at the same time. Fame had always asked her to perform strength, but this moment required something else entirely. When the message finally came, it was simple, unpolished, and honest. No strategy, no apology, no explanation, just acknowledgement. Their exchange didn't focus on the clip itself, but on how strange it felt to have something genuine mistaken for spectacle. They spoke about how easily kindness becomes a headline when the world is starving for it, and how dangerous it can be to let that hunger dictate your next move. Neither of them wanted to turn a human moment into a narrative shaped by expectation. They had lived that life before, and both carried the quiet scars it left behind. As the day wore on, the attention intensified, but something unexpected happened alongside it. Messages arrived from people neither of them knew, stories shared not out of curiosity but gratitude. Strangers spoke of grief survived, of laughter rediscovered after loss, of how seeing two familiar faces sit without pretense had reminded them that healing didn't always need drama. Sandra read those messages slowly, carefully, as if afraid that skimming them would cheapen their sincerity. Keanu read fewer, but the ones he did read stayed with him, settling into his thoughts like unanswered questions about responsibility and choice. That evening they met again, not in public, not somewhere picturesque, but in a quiet park where the paths were uneven and the benches worn by years of unnoticed conversations. There were no cameras this time, only the soft rustle of leaves and the low hum of the city far enough away to feel irrelevant. They walked side by side without rushing, both aware that what they were doing was simple, and because of that, unusually difficult. To be present without performance, to exist without explanation, required more courage than either of them had expected. Sandra spoke first, not about the world's reaction, but about fear. The quiet kind that arrives after something good happens, the fear that happiness might demand a price later. Keanu listened without interrupting, his attention steady, his presence unforced. When he responded, it wasn't with reassurance but perspective, the kind shaped by years of learning that joy doesn't promise permanence, only honesty. They talked about aging, about how life narrows your circle not out of cruelty but clarity, and how rare it is to find someone who remembers you before the armor hardened. As the sky darkened, they sat without speaking for a while, the silence no longer awkward but earned. Sandra laughed again at something small, something ordinary, and this time there was no shock attached to it, no sudden realization, just ease. Keanu noticed it with quiet gratitude, not because it was new, but because it no longer felt fragile. In that moment, he understood that what had unsettled him about the clip wasn't the exposure, but the reminder of how easily truth can be reshaped once it leaves your hands. They parted without ceremony, without promises, without the kind of words that feel heavy the moment they're spoken. As Sandra walked away, she felt lighter than she had in months, not because the world had seen her smile, but because she hadn't hidden it. Keanu watched her disappear into the dim light and felt something settle inside him, something that resembled peace but didn't pretend to be permanent. He knew the world would keep watching, would keep speculating, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel obligated to respond. That night, as the city continued its endless conversation without them, both carried the same quiet understanding to sleep. What mattered wasn't the whisper, or the camera, or the story being written without their consent. What mattered was that somewhere between memory and the present, they had chosen honesty over control, connection over performance. And in doing so, they had reclaimed something fame had never been able to offer them in the first place, the freedom to be human without explanation. When old wounds spoke louder than applause, the days that followed carried a strange weight, not heavy enough to crush, but persistent enough to demand attention, like a question that refuses to be ignored. For Keanu Reeves, the world seemed louder than usual, not because people were speaking more, but because he was listening differently. He found himself noticing how often silence had protected him over the years, how retreat had become a language he spoke fluently without realizing it. Yet now, after that single unguarded moment, silence felt less like refuge and more like avoidance, and that distinction unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He tried to return to routine, to the familiar comfort of long walks, early mornings, and scripts he read without commitment, but something had shifted internally. The stories he was offered felt hollow, not because they lacked quality, but because they echoed lives lived loudly without reflection. He wasn't judging them, he simply no longer recognized himself in them. Every so often, his mind returned to the same image, not the viral clip, not the headlines, but the way Sandra Bullock had looked when she laughed without reservation, as if something long dormant had finally exhaled. That image didn't haunt him, but it challenged him, asking whether he was still living according to truths he believed in or merely habits he had perfected. Sandra, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. Invitations arrived framed in enthusiasm and opportunity, each one subtly referencing the renewed attention surrounding her name. Meetings that had once been about projects now carried undertones of curiosity, questions carefully disguised as professional interest. She navigated them with grace, but inside, she felt the familiar fatigue of being interpreted rather than understood. It wasn't the attention itself that troubled her. It was the realization that people seemed more interested in what the moment symbolized than what it actually meant. For years, she had learned to protect herself by smiling through assumptions, but this time, the instinct felt wrong. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes she had postponed opening for years, Sandra stumbled upon photographs she hadn't planned to revisit. Behind-the-scenes moments, unpolished and imperfect, reminders of a time when laughter had been frequent and expectations lighter. She lingered on one particular image, not because it captured success, but because it captured ease. The realization came slowly, then all at once. She hadn't lost her ability to laugh. She had learned to ration it in a world that often demanded too much without giving enough back. The cafe moment hadn't created something new. It had revealed something she had been protecting. When she reached out to Keanu again, it wasn't prompted by the world's curiosity, but by her own unease. Their conversation unfolded without urgency, touching on things neither had spoken aloud before. She admitted how exhausting it felt to constantly reassure others that she was fine, how strength had become an expectation rather than a choice. Keanu listened, not as someone searching for solutions, but as someone who understood that some wounds only need acknowledgement to begin healing. He shared his own struggle, how distance had once felt like self-preservation, but now felt like a wall built too well to dismantle easily. They met again, this time indoors, away from open spaces and chance encounters, in a place chosen not for privacy alone, but for comfort. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask to be filled. They sat across from each other, not mirroring the cafe moment, but continuing it, as if the conversation had simply paused rather than ended. Sandra spoke about fear, not of loss, but of hope, of how dangerous it feels to believe in something good when you've learned how easily good things can slip away. Keanu responded with honesty that wasn't rehearsed, admitting that he had spent years preparing himself for endings, instead of allowing himself to enjoy beginnings. As they talked, an unspoken tension surfaced, not romantic, not nostalgic, but deeply human. It was the tension between who they had been and who they were still becoming, between memory and possibility. Sandra realized that seeing Keanu again hadn't reopened old wounds. It had revealed which ones had never fully healed. Keanu realized that his calm exterior had sometimes been mistaken for resolution when it was, in truth, a form of quiet endurance. Neither blamed the other. They simply recognized the shared responsibility of having survived lives that rarely slowed down long enough to ask how they were really doing. Outside the room, the world continued to speculate, but inside, something steadier took shape. They spoke about what it meant to age in an industry that celebrates youth while demanding relevance, about the loneliness that can come from being constantly admired but rarely known. Sandra confessed that laughter for her had once felt like a risk, an opening she wasn't sure she could afford. Keanu admitted that he had learned to keep joy understated, fearing that anything cherished too openly might invite loss. The realization that they had both been guarding the same fragile things created a bond rooted not in shared history alone, but in shared understanding. When they parted that evening, there was no sense of resolution, but there was clarity. Both understood that the past had shaped them, but it no longer needed to define them. Sandra walked away feeling lighter, not because she had found answers, but because she had allowed herself to ask questions without fear. Keanu remained behind for a moment, reflecting on how rare it is to encounter someone who doesn't demand explanations, someone who sees the spaces between words and respects them. Later that night, as each returned to separate lives temporarily tethered by an unexpected reconnection, the same thought settled quietly in both of them. Healing doesn't arrive all at once, and it doesn't announce itself with certainty. Sometimes it begins simply with the courage to stay present when old wounds speak, to listen without retreating, and to believe that laughter once rediscovered doesn't have to be rationed anymore. When the noise demanded answers, they chose truth. By the time the fourth week arrived, the world's curiosity had matured into expectation, and expectation has a way of pressing on people even when no one is touching them. For Keanu Reeves, the pressure did not arrive as panic or fear, but as a quiet discomfort that followed him through ordinary moments, the sense that every silence was being interpreted, every step measured for meaning he never intended to provide. He noticed it when he stopped for groceries and someone lingered a second longer than necessary, when a stranger smiled with a familiarity that felt earned by observation rather than relationship. None of it was cruel, yet all of it reminded him that privacy, once broken, never fully returns to its original shape. Sandra felt it too, though it settled in her differently. Invitations arrived framed as kindness, but carried undertones of anticipation, as if she were expected to complete a story others had already written in their minds. Interviews that once focused on work now drifted gently but persistently toward questions about timing, connection, and what the moment meant. She answered with grace, redirecting conversations without confrontation, but each deflection required energy, and she began to feel the familiar exhaustion of being asked to translate something deeply personal into something easily consumed. It wasn't that she resented interest. It was that she refused to let sincerity be simplified. They spoke often now, not out of obligation, but because conversation had become grounding rather than draining. Their discussions were unstructured, moving from memories to present concerns, from humor to vulnerability without warning. One evening, Sandra admitted something she hadn't allowed herself to articulate before, that being seen again in this way stirred both joy and fear, because joy makes loss feel possible again. Keanu understood immediately, not because he shared the same fear in identical form, but because he recognized the pattern of protecting oneself by lowering expectations. He didn't try to counter her feelings with reassurance. Instead, he acknowledged them, offering validation rather than solutions, which somehow felt more stabilizing than comfort ever could. As public interest continued, opportunities emerged that forced them to confront a question neither had planned to answer so soon. A proposal arrived suggesting a joint appearance, framed as a celebration of their shared history and mutual respect, carefully worded to avoid sensationalism yet undeniably designed to capitalize on attention. The offer was polite, lucrative, and tempting in its promise to control the narrative rather than be controlled by it. Sandra considered it thoughtfully, weighing the possibility of reclaiming agency against the risk of turning something authentic into performance. Keanu listened as she talked through it, noticing how carefully she separated intention from outcome, how deeply she wanted to protect the honesty they had rediscovered. When he shared his perspective, it was measured, shaped by years of learning that not every opportunity aligns with personal truth. He spoke about how easily clarity can be lost when decisions are made in response to noise rather than values, and how tempting it is to believe that explanation will quiet speculation, when often it only feeds it. Sandra recognized the wisdom in his restraint, yet also felt the pull of visibility, the idea that perhaps honesty shared openly could inspire rather than dilute. The tension between those views did not divide them. Instead, it revealed how differently each had learned to survive the same industry. They met again, this time with intention rather than coincidence, choosing a setting that encouraged reflection rather than reaction. The conversation was longer, heavier, but also clarifying. Sandra spoke about how laughter had returned to her life unexpectedly, and how she feared losing it by mishandling what came next. Keanu spoke about how he had spent years believing that stepping back was the most respectful response to attention, only to realize that absence can sometimes be misread as indifference. Together, they acknowledged that neither extreme held the full answer, and that authenticity rarely fits neatly into public frameworks. As the night deepened, they reached an understanding that surprised them both in its simplicity. They would not rush to explain themselves, nor would they hide in silence. Instead, they would allow their actions to speak gradually, choosing moments that aligned with who they were rather than who they were expected to be. It wasn't a strategy. It was a boundary, one built on mutual respect rather than fear. Sandra felt relief settle into her shoulders, the kind that comes when a decision honors both instinct and integrity. Keanu felt something similar, a quiet confidence that they were no longer reacting, but choosing. In the days that followed, the world noticed subtle changes rather than dramatic statements. Sandra appeared calmer, more selective, her laughter surfacing naturally rather than defensively. Keanu moved through public spaces with the same humility he always had, but now with a steadiness that suggested resolution rather than retreat. Observers continued to speculate, but without new fuel, the conversation softened, shifting from obsession to appreciation. People began speaking less about what they hoped would happen, and more about what they admired in what already had. Privately, both reflected on how easily the noise could have overtaken them, how close they had come to allowing external pressure to define an internal truth. Sandra recognized that the courage to remain undefined was, in itself, a form of strength she hadn't exercised in years. Keanu recognized that presence did not require performance, only honesty, and that choosing when to speak can be as meaningful as choosing when not to. Their connection deepened not through grand gestures, but through shared restraint, through the mutual decision to protect something fragile by refusing to rush it. As part 4 closed, neither of them felt they had reached an ending, nor did they need one. What mattered was that they had confronted the noise together, acknowledged the old wounds it stirred, and chosen truth over convenience. In doing so, they discovered that healing is not always about moving forward quickly, but about standing still long enough to decide which direction is worth taking. When courage chose quiet over applause, time did what it always does when people stop chasing it. It slowed, not in hours or days, but in feeling. For Keanu Reeves, the weeks after their decision felt different from anything he had known before. Not dramatic, not empty, but steady, as if his life had finally found a rhythm that didn't require constant adjustment. He noticed it in small ways, the absence of urgency when he woke, the patience he felt while waiting at a stoplight, the ease with which he could let a message sit unanswered without guilt. The world continued to watch, but it no longer felt like it was leaning in close enough to steal his breath. For Sandra Bullock, the change was quieter but just as profound. She found herself laughing more easily, not because she forced it, but because she stopped questioning whether she deserved it. The fear that happiness might vanish if acknowledged began to loosen its grip, replaced by a gentler understanding that joy does not need permission to exist. She still worked, still showed up when it mattered, but she no longer measured her worth by how convincingly she could appear untroubled. There was strength in that shift, and she felt it most when she allowed herself to be unguarded without explanation. They didn't meet constantly, and that restraint mattered. Each time they did come together, it felt intentional rather than habitual, chosen rather than assumed. One evening, they attended a small charity gathering, not as a statement, but because the cause aligned with values they both held quietly rather than advertised. The room was warm, the lighting soft, the energy focused less on recognition and more on shared purpose. They arrived separately, greeted people kindly, and when they found themselves standing side by side, it felt natural rather than staged. There was no announcement, no orchestration, just presence. During the event, a moment arose that tested everything they had chosen. A brief introduction invited them forward together, not demanded, just offered, the kind of invitation that feels harmless but carries weight. Sandra hesitated for a fraction of a second, aware of the cameras, aware of how easily the narrative could shift if she misstepped. Keanu noticed the pause and met her gaze, not with reassurance but with trust. He wasn't asking her to follow, he was offering to stand with her if she chose to move. That distinction mattered more than any promise ever could. They accepted the invitation without speeches or declarations, sharing only a few words about the cause, keeping the focus where it belonged. The room responded not with explosive applause but with something warmer, more sustained, a recognition that authenticity, when offered without demand, resonates more deeply than spectacle. As they stepped away, Sandra felt the tension release from her shoulders, the realization settling in that she had not lost herself by being seen. She had found herself by choosing how to be seen. Later that night, away from the crowd, they walked together in quiet streets that carried the hum of the city without its glare. Sandra spoke about how that small moment had frightened her more than any premiere, because it asked her to be present rather than polished. Keanu listened, then shared how he had once believed courage meant enduring quietly, only to learn that it sometimes means stepping forward gently, without armor, trusting that truth does not need amplification to be heard. As they continued, Sandra admitted something she hadn't planned to say, that seeing him choose calm over control had given her permission to do the same. She realized that much of her life had been shaped by expectations she never consciously accepted, and that letting go of them felt both liberating and unsettling. Keanu responded not with advice but with empathy, acknowledging how difficult it is to rewrite patterns that once kept you safe, even when they no longer serve you. The conversation flowed without urgency, deepening not because of what was said, but because of what was allowed to remain unsaid. They paused at a corner where the city opened into quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows that softened rather than obscured. Sandra laughed then, not out of humor, but relief, the sound carrying a sense of arrival rather than escape. Keanu smiled, recognizing it instantly, understanding that this laugh was different from the one the world had noticed weeks earlier. That one had been rediscovery, this one was acceptance. He didn't comment on it, didn't mark it as significant, because he knew that naming it might tether it too tightly to meaning. Some moments grow best when left alone. As the night deepened, they parted with the same simplicity that had begun their reconnection, no promises framed for longevity, no conclusions forced for comfort. Sandra walked away feeling grounded rather than suspended, aware that whatever came next did not need to be dramatic to be meaningful. Keanu watched her go with a quiet gratitude, not for what the future might hold, but for what the present had already offered. In the days that followed, the world continued its conversation, but it sounded different now, softer, less insistent. Observers spoke not of speculation, but of admiration, not of outcomes, but of character. Without intending to, Keanu and Sandra had shifted the tone simply by refusing to perform their truth. And in that refusal, they discovered something neither had expected. That courage, when chosen quietly, has a way of echoing farther than applause ever could. When peace became the loudest truth, the final turning point did not arrive with announcement or spectacle, but with a calm so complete that both Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock recognized it only in hindsight. It came in the form of ordinary days stitched together by intentional choices, days where neither of them felt compelled to explain themselves to the world or to each other. The quiet they had chosen began to feel less like a pause and more like a destination, a place earned through years of endurance and the recent courage to stop performing strength. Keanu noticed that his thoughts no longer circled around what might be expected of him next, but instead rested on what felt honest now. Sandra noticed that laughter had stopped being a moment she analyzed and had become something she trusted again, a reflex rather than a risk. They met one last time before life inevitably carried them into separate rhythms again, not because they needed closure, but because presence had become something they valued enough to choose deliberately. The place was unremarkable by design, a simple overlook where the city stretched out without demanding attention, the kind of place people pass without noticing because it offers no drama. They sat side by side, the silence between them full rather than empty, shaped by weeks of understanding rather than avoidance. Sandra spoke about how strange it felt to no longer feel chased by her own expectations, how relief had arrived quietly once she stopped asking herself who she needed to be for others. Keanu listened, recognizing the same shift within himself, the way responsibility had transformed from obligation into choice once he allowed himself to be present without retreating. As they talked, they reflected not on what had been lost over the years, but on what had endured beneath distance and change. They acknowledged that their connection had never required reinvention, only attention, and that what the world had witnessed was not a rekindling of something dramatic, but the resurfacing of something steady. Sandra admitted that she no longer feared happiness disappearing, because she understood now that joy does not vanish when noticed, it deepens when respected. Keanu shared that he had learned presence does not demand permanence, only sincerity, and that some connections are meant to exist without labels, free from the weight of expectation. When they stood to leave, there was no sadness attached to the moment, no sense of ending disguised as acceptance. Instead, there was gratitude, the kind that settles into the body gently and stays. Sandra smiled, not the smile that had once been captured and interpreted, but one meant only for the person standing beside her, and Keanu returned it with the same quiet understanding that had shaped their entire journey. There were no whispers this time, no cameras waiting to translate intimacy into narrative, only two people who had learned that peace does not announce itself. It simply arrives when you stop running from yourself. In the weeks that followed, the world gradually moved on, as it always does, attention shifting toward newer stories, louder moments, quicker conclusions. Yet something subtle remained. People remembered not the speculation, but the feeling, the reminder that kindness can exist without performance, that healing can happen without confession, that laughter regained can be more powerful than any declaration. Keanu returned to his life with a renewed sense of alignment, choosing work and solitude with equal intention, no longer confusing distance with safety. Sandra stepped forward into her projects with clarity rather than armor, allowing joy to accompany her without suspicion. They did not issue statements, did not frame their experience for public consumption, because they no longer felt the need to be understood by everyone. What mattered was that they understood themselves better, and that they had met each other in a moment of truth rather than nostalgia. The whisper that once caught the world's attention faded into memory, but the lesson it carried endured quietly, living on in the way they chose presence over performance, truth over noise, and peace over applause. And so the story did not end with a promise or a revelation, but with something far more lasting. It ended with two people who had walked through the weight of expectation and emerged softer rather than hardened, who had allowed a single moment of honesty to reshape how they moved through the world. When Keanu Reeves saw Sandra laugh again, it was never about what was captured or shared. It was about what was restored, and that restoration, quiet and complete, belonged to them alone.